In Iraq, American forces are locked in an intense battle. Miles and his teammates rush into a crumbling building for cover while continuing to fire at the enemy. Tragedy strikes when their captain is shot in the neck and dies quickly in Miles's arms from heavy bleeding. Suddenly, an explosion shakes the entire building and a bright light fills the area. Despite the chaos, Miles heads back out to fight. As he charges up a hill, he's hit in the stomach by a bullet and collapses to the ground. Looking up in pain, Miles spots two missile-like objects flying by, followed by a strange aircraft. The aircraft shines a bright light directly on him, causing him to scream before he passes out. Sometime later, Miles regains consciousness in pain, finding himself inside a strange, windowless, and doorless room. The walls are covered in gray panels from corner to corner. Struggling, he forces himself to stand, but his stomach wound is bleeding heavily. Unable to hold himself up, he collapses again. He shouts for help, but there's no response. Desperate, he uses his emergency supplies to clean and wrap his wound. He tries using his radio, but it doesn't work. Looking around, he notices the word abandon written on one of the walls, even though it wasn't there before. He calls for help again, trying a few words in Arabic, but still gets no response. When he looks back at the wall, the phrase has changed to abandon all, and then the floor reads, save the sinner's soul. Moments later, the words shift again to say, abandon all hope. The temperature in the room starts to rise quickly. Miles removes his backpack and clothes, noticing how fast his body is sweating. In a panic, he hits the walls, begging to be let out. His sweat begins to boil when it hits the floor, and the unbearable heat causes him to lose his grip on reality. In desperation, he fires his gun at the walls. Eventually, the heat overwhelms him, and he collapses to the floor in agony before passing out again. When Miles wakes up, the temperature has returned to normal. He scrambles for his flask to drink water, but the room suddenly starts spinning violently. He and his belongings are thrown around, and he gets injured each time he hits the spinning walls. After a few minutes, the spinning finally stops. Miles realizes the room has shifted position, with the words now in different spots and some of his belongings stuck to the ceiling. At first, he panics, thinking he's dreaming. Once he calms down, he tries the radio again. After several minutes of silence, he hears a woman's voice, but the call ends quickly. Miles suspects the room is refracting the signal and remembers his cell phone, which is now stuck on the ceiling. Since he can't recall his number, he uses binoculars to read the sticker on the phone and carves the number onto the floor with his knife. Suddenly, the phone starts ringing. He jumps to reach it, but the effort worsens his wound. Next, he throws a shoe at the phone, but it gets stuck on the ceiling too. Suddenly, frost starts forming on the walls, and Miles scrambles to put on whatever clothes he can reach before curling up into a fetal position. The frost quickly covers his face too, and moments later, it disappears as fast as it came. Left with purple fingers, Miles rubs his body to warm himself up. At that moment, the phone rings again, but instead of answering, he flips it off. An alarm blares, and the room starts moving once more. The spinning causes the phone to fall, and Miles is painfully thrown around again. Determined, he manages to grab the phone before the spinning stops. Along with the phone, he also recovers his helmet, so he takes out a picture of his wife and daughter from it and carefully tucks it into his pocket. To regain some energy, he chews on a piece of gum he had hidden during battle. Miles checks the call log and redials the number that had called him earlier. At first, there's only static, but soon, a woman's voice comes through. She explains that she's been kidnapped and is trapped in a spinning room. When Miles asks her to describe it, he realizes it's identical to his own. The woman mentions that there are no visible light sources, yet everything is lit. Miles examines his own surroundings and concludes their bodies must be acting as the light sources. Miles asks the woman some questions to learn more about her situation, but she becomes suspicious, thinking he's part of a scam. Frustrated, he yells at her, insisting he's trapped and bleeding too. The woman starts crying and apologizes, agreeing to work together. She introduces herself as Damsey and explains she was driving on the highway before being kidnapped. Miles connects the dots and remembers his team was near the highway. When Damsey asks if he was stationed there, Miles panics. He hadn't mentioned being a soldier. Damsey quickly reassures him, saying she figured it out from the way he talks and the questions he asked. Suddenly, Damsey stops speaking and grunts in pain. At the same time, Miles's dog tags are yanked back, choking him as an invisible force pulls his arms wide open, making him drop the phone. His body begins floating, and a bright light stretches all his limbs before dropping him hard to the ground. On the phone, Miles hears Damsey hit the ground too. A strange noise fills the room, and Miles warns Damsey that the room is about to move again. However, instead of spinning, the walls start closing in. Panicking, Miles tries to push against the wall, but falls and passes out from the strain. When he wakes up, the room has shrunk, Overwhelmed, he has a panic attack, but Damsey calls again and helps calm him down with soft, reassuring words. Meanwhile, Damsey is cursing because she's trying to reset her dislocated shoulder. Miles notices new writing on the walls in languages he doesn't recognize. Damsey confirms that similar writing has appeared in her room too. She also mentions something strange. Nobody grabbed her when she was on the highway. Instead, she describes a location in Massachusetts that sounds familiar. Miles realizes it doesn't add up for them to be communicating since his phone works on a closed network, and he still believes they're in Iraq. Damsey starts freaking out too, pointing out that setting up something like this would take days, yet she insists she's only been in the room for about an hour. She's just an ordinary person, so she can't understand why anyone would take her. She mentions that right before being kidnapped, she saw the same strange things in the sky that Miles described. Miles starts yelling through his walls to see if Damsey might be in a nearby bunker, but she doesn't hear him. He wonders how she got his number, and Damsey says it showed up on her ceiling. Suddenly, the phone announces another call. Miles tells Damsey to call him back later and answers the new call. A man speaking in another language begins talking, so Miles asks for English. The man struggles, but manages to say that they can't win because they can't solve the equation, so they must die. Before Miles can ask any questions, the call ends, and the phone switches back to Damsey. Miles asks Damsey if she knows anything about an equation while rebandaging his wound, but she has no idea what he's talking about. Damsey suggests they try to figure out why they were chosen since she can't believe it's random. She shares that she's an algebra teacher and engaged to a former soldier. However, her tone makes it clear she isn't happy, hinting that her fiancé changed a lot after returning from the war. Miles admits that things between him and his wife aren't great either. As he eats the last of the rations from his backpack, Miles watches the words on the walls, some of which include years ranging from 1951 to 2007. He thinks the years are fake and meant to mess with them because, in his mind, it's still 1991. Damsey laughs when she realizes he isn't using a smartphone and starts joking about social media and selfies, which only confuses Miles. Suddenly, the room begins to glow and emit a piercing noise that makes Miles's ears bleed. Even in pain, he glances at his watch and notices the room's movements are happening more frequently. He writes the times on his arm before collapsing, screaming in agony, and passing out. When he wakes up, he's trembling and struggling to breathe. He notices the phone ringing but feels too weak to pick it up. The word answer appears on the wall, so he forces himself to grab the phone. Miles tells Damsey there isn't enough air, and he finally realizes the room has shrunk even more. Damsey confirms her room has also gotten smaller and shares her theory. She believes that she, Miles, and others are all in the same room but existing in different years. She asks Miles to draw something on the wall to test her idea. He marks an X, and moments later, it's surrounded by a hand drawn by Damsey. She reveals it's the year 2020 in her time. She talks about the fourth dimension and explains how she's always been above average in math, prompting Miles to admit that he's great at math too, even though he was never interested in academics. Miles collapses from exhaustion, commenting that whoever is behind this is probably testing their bodies with all these strange room changes. He asks Damsey about the future and feels crushed to learn the war is still ongoing. He calls it the sins of the father and shares that his own dad fought in Vietnam. Miles passes out mid-conversation, but Damsey calls his name, waking him up as she says she needs him. At that moment, Miles notices his Arabic dictionary has fallen out of his bag. He realizes some of the symbols on the wall match ones in the book. He quickly starts translating the message and writes it on the floor for Damsey to see. The result is an equation. Damsey recognizes it as the work of a famous mathematician who studied higher dimensions, but the equation was never finished. This makes them realize that another trapped person must be a mathematician who left it as a clue, and they piece together that all the kidnapped people are somehow connected to math. Suddenly, someone starts scribbling over both the Arabic equation and the translation to obscure them. Miles scrambles to write what he remembers on his arm before it's completely gone. Damsey then confesses that although she works as a teacher, she actually has an advanced degree in math. Her fiancé got her the teaching job because he doesn't like it when she talks smart. Damsey asks if the war has changed Miles and caused him to hurt someone he loves. Miles admits war turns people into animals. Guessing Damsey's fiancé might be abusive, Miles shares a story from his childhood. His dad used to beat his mom, and Miles couldn't stop him because he was too young. One day, when Miles tried to intervene, his dad threw him onto a pull-out bed and shut it, trapping him. He couldn't move or breathe, only listen to his dad hitting his mom. Damsey focuses and manages to recall the equation, so Miles urges her to write it on the wall before the room changes again. Damsey struggles struggles because she's using her keys to scratch the wall, which is slow and difficult. Suddenly, the room starts shaking, and Miles feels his hands being forced to the ground by an intense gravitational pull. He tries to lift them but can't, as the pull grows stronger. Soon his knees are pinned down, and the bullet from his wound is pulled out by the force. Then his face slams into the floor, making him bleed even more. Miles screams as the gravity crushes his entire body, but it only lasts for a few minutes before it's over. Shaking, Miles grabs the phone, only to curse when he sees the screen is cracked. The alarm blares again, and the room begins spinning once more. Since the space has gotten smaller, Miles is now able to jump from wall to wall instead of being thrown around. The spinning ends quickly this time, and the lights go out for a few seconds. When they come back on, Miles realizes the room has shrunk even more. Trembling, he tells himself to stay calm and tries the phone. Miles tries the phone again, ready to give up when nothing happens, but Damsey eventually answers. Their conversation is cut short by a call from the foreign man, who cryptically says they can't see or know. He keeps repeating, "fail sacrifice," but Miles can't figure out what it means and ends the call. When the static stops, he reconnects with Damsey, who tells him her arm is broken, her phone is running out of battery, and she thinks their only option is to die. Miles realizes Damsey has been in contact with the foreign man the whole time. Pressed for answers, Damsey finally explains. They've been captured by a superior alien species testing human intelligence to determine if humanity is a threat. Damsey believes humans aren't smart enough to pose a danger, but Miles insists they can learn to control the room with enough focus. As Damsey analyzes the equation, thinking it might be the key to escaping, the room goes dark. In the pitch black, Miles screams and curses at the aliens, ignoring Damsey's attempts to calm him. Flashbacks from his time in the war and memories of his dad abusing his mom overwhelm him. Miles writhes on the floor, reaching for his gun, but he's helpless against the mental onslaught. When the flashbacks stop, Miles breaks down and tells the aliens they've won. He begs them to end his suffering and prepares to end his life if they don't. Crying, he reflects on his trauma and asks his dad why he killed his mom, admitting he feels himself becoming like his father, a path he doesn't want to follow. Determined not to give in, Miles lowers the gun and calls Damsey, who is also in tears. Damsey confesses that she's haunted by memories of her abusive fiancé. She reveals scars from the times he hurt her and shares how she finally ran away, driving so recklessly down the highway that she crashed right before the aliens took her. Damsey asks if Miles ever hurt his wife. Miles admits he didn't, but he's had violent urges. Disgusted, Damsey hangs up. Miles gets another call from the foreign man, who berates him for trying to solve the equation. The man warns that if they win, humanity will become just as dangerous as the aliens. He insists it's better for Earth to appear harmless, like innocent lab rats, so the aliens don't see them as a threat. Suddenly, the alarm blares, and the room begins shrinking again. Miles struggles to stop it, but there's nothing he can do. The space gets tighter and tighter, contorting his body painfully. As Miles endures the pressure, Damsey calls again, asking if he's ever hurt his family. Miles swears he never did, explaining that although he had violent thoughts, he fought them to avoid becoming like his dad. He admits he feels broken and insists Damsey is the better person. She deserves to solve the equation and escape, not him. Miles apologizes for the person he is and for everything Damsey has gone through. Touched, Damsey forgives him. Miles asks her to find his family and tell them he loves them and that they deserve better. With those words, Damsey feels strong enough to focus and finish solving the equation. She notices the timing of the room's movements and realizes the answer is 1. Damsey tries to take control of the room and spin it once, but nothing happens. Thinking it through, she realizes the number 1 doesn't refer to an individual. It represents humanity as a whole. The aliens want to see if humans can stop fighting and work together. Miles joins her effort, focusing his energy and pushing against the room as well. Both of them scream as they concentrate, and suddenly, the room explodes into a blinding light. To their amazement, Miles and Damsey find themselves floating in the light, their hands touching. Around them, the wall panels hover in pieces, revealing all the other people who were kidnapped. They've solved the equation and freed everyone. Smiling at each other, Damsey and Miles say a simple hi before disappearing into the light. Moments later, Miles wakes up back in Iraq. He stumbles to his feet and begins making his way back to his team. As he moves, he hears sirens wailing and looks up to see planes flying overhead. When he finds the American troops, they're all staring at something ominous in the sky. Don't forget to subscribe. Here's some more interesting story you don't want to miss.